Anytime that two cultures encounter one another, two new societies encounter one another, there is inevitably a process of interaction and exchange and adjustment that just has to take place. And this is something that anthropologists call acculturation. Well, there is that kind of acculturation, and within it, there can be something that we would call military acculturation. As previously noted, wars by Anglo-Americans against Native Americans continued for centuries. And that fact alone suggests that the struggle was far from a walkover for either side. Over time, in fact, both sides found it necessary to adapt the methods, or to adopt the methods, technologies, and even to some extent the values of the opposing side in order to fight more successfully. And this constituted a specific type of acculturation, military acculturation, and it had lasting consequences. Violent conflict with Europeans led to obvious modifications in the way that Native Americans made war. Because in Native American societies, land was plentiful and people were relatively scarce, Native American tribes did not wage wars of conquest. There was no point in it. A common motive for war was a redress of grievances. If waged in the name of retaliation, an Indian war ostensibly ceased when the aggrieved party had achieved retribution and inflicted retribution. Otherwise, Native hostilities generally aimed at symbolic ascendancy, a status conveyed by small payments of tribute to the victors rather than the domination normally associated with a European-style conquest. But when Europeans fought for control of land, the Native American conception of war shifted so that it too encompassed warfare aimed at territorial defense or territorial conquest. And to keep up with the English, Native Americans also had to modify their traditional ways of warfare, which now extended to attacks on women and children and crops and so on, things that they had not done before. And a common English strategy that the Native Americans sometimes attempted but could not match was something called the feed fight. And when the English spoke of the feed fight, what they meant was the systematic, complete destruction of Native American crops growing in the fields. And since Native Americans had little surplus already harvested crops to fall back upon, the destruction of their crops threatened starvation for everyone. Just the burning of fields of corn or other vegetables, particularly corn, though, just could be devastating to a Native American community, and would call forth the most desperate kind of response. And ironically, when the Native Americans themselves adopted these European methods of what we would now call total war, Europeans saw it as evidence of Indians' intrinsic savagery. Oh, look how savage they are. They're attacking women and children and burning crops and so on. And indeed, Indians were soon accused of having been the first to employ such methods. Now, Native Americans who originally fought with tomahawk, lance, and bow and arrow found it helpful to adopt the European musket. This helped them against the English for sure and gave them a potent psychological advantage over rival tribes that were not equipped with muskets. But to secure such muskets and the powder and the ammunition and the equipment to operate and repair them, that obliged Native Americans to trade with Europeans and often conclude alliances with them. And this in turn helped to place them in the thick of the Anglo-French rivalry as it sort of came to a boil. And you begin to see a round of colonial wars beginning in 1689. Moreover, the enhanced effectiveness of firearms made it easier to kill deer, many of whom were wounded by imperfect shots and escaped their hunters only to die later uselessly. And this increased killing of deer upset the ecological balance on which the indigenous Native American way of life depended. Firearms made intertribal wars more deadly, since a warrior now required little skill to kill another one. And trade with Europeans to secure firearms produced new motives for war. For example, Europeans wanted furs, take back to Europe to be made into hats and other kinds of things. So there's this lucrative fur trade. Well, you only have beaver pelts and so forth. They can only be found, beavers can only be found in certain areas. And so Native American communities would now find themselves locked in conflict over the best areas in which to trap fur. So you have that. You have wars now to secure control over strategic trade routes, now that trade has become so important, and so on. Colonists had to adapt too, to a lesser but significant degree. To begin with, they had to adopt some of the Native Americans' tactics, raids and ambushes, which initially your English said it's cowardly the way that those Indians skulk around and they fire from ambush, and nobody has a chance to know that they're coming, and it's just terrible. Well, it was effective and the way that the Europeans would sort of march around in their clunky armor, and this kind of thing might have made sense on a European battlefield, but it made no sense at all in the wilderness of North America. So they did what worked. They did what the Native Americans did. Yeah, Native American warriors could easily avoid a European style advance with beating drums and mass columns. And so again, colonists had to adopt the techniques of the stealthy raid and the ambuscade. Colonists also found it necessary to conduct scouting expeditions in the Native American fashion, which is to say, small parties of men, well-versed in wood lore, living off the land, ranging over long distances for extended periods. And to do so required the adoption of Native American technologies. And technology doesn't always mean what you might think it means. A very pertinent technology was the moccasin for stealth, leather clothing to withstand the brush, also snowshoes, which gave formerly snowbound colonists, if you're in New England and there's a blizzard and so forth, and you're stuck, you can't move. But once you've adopted the Native American use of snowshoes, that gives you the ability to move safely over the top of snow drifts and so on. So the adoption of snowshoes transformed a formerly dangerous season for English colonists into one of relative safety. Other tactics: scattering to take advantage of cover and concealment, walking Indian file, so-called, with several yards in between each other and with flankers out to avoid ambush and so on. And some of these developments became part of long-term American military traditions. For example, the Rangers. What you're looking at there is an illustration of Rogers Rangers, which is a company of soldiers from the province of New Hampshire, raised by Major Robert Rogers and attached to the British Army during the French and Indian War. And if Rangers sounds familiar to you, it's because Rogers Rangers became the inspiration for the modern U.S. Army Rangers when the U.S. Army decided to develop, in effect, a kind of a commando type set of outfits, had to give it a name. They came up with Rangers. And the first modern Ranger unit was created in 1942. What you're looking at are the Rangers who famously stormed the German battery at Pont du Hoc on D-Day in 1944.